I'm Zoe Bender, and this is my teaching demonstration for our teaching skills class. Welcome. I want to start out today's class by just taking a moment to connect in with our breath and our bodies. So let's close our eyes and just begin to notice your breath, how it passes through your nostrils, expands and then deflates your rib cage. Feel your feet on the floor and notice that you're connected to the earth. And if any sensations arise, just observe them with neutrality or equanimity. Letting those sensations arrive and dissipate with no judgment or attachment. If you notice any tension in your body, send some breath to those places so that you can start to soften your whole physical being into this present moment. And we can start to flutter our eyes open. Throughout today's class, I just invite you to be aware of your breath and any sensations that might arise, and just observe them with no judgment or attachment. So today we're going to be getting familiar with Liz Lerman's critical response process, which is a really useful tool for giving feedback to one another when we share work, which is something that we're going to be doing throughout the year together. So we'll be using this process quite a lot. So Liz Lerman's critical response process is a structured feedback process that, in my experience, helps to cultivate a climate of generosity, but also maintains a really specific and rigorous critique practice. So I find it to be really useful, and I hope that you will too. Just to give you some background, Liz Lerman is a white American woman in her 60s. She's a choreographer, a writer, an educator, and a performer who's been making really interesting and experimental work for 40 years. She's a brilliant artist, and she also has made some really important contributions to the field of communicating about art. So we send our gratitude to Liz Lerman. This process has 4 very distinct steps, and it's a highly structured process. The first step is statements of meaning. The second step is artist as questioner. The third step is neutral questions from responder. And the fourth step is permissioned opinions. So I'll be explaining what each of those steps is, and then we're going to be seeing an example of a piece of work, and I'll be doing a role play where I'm playing both roles of the artist presenter and the audience responder. So let's get to the first step. Step 1 is statements of meaning. So this is after an artist or student has shown their work, and the audience, the first thing that happens is that the audience is going to describe how they connected with the work, what was meaningful to them in the work. So this is an affirmation that some communication has happened. Some words that are really useful in this step of the process are, if you're an audience member giving your statement of meaning, you might say, what was really meaningful to, sorry, not what was meaningful, what was really stimulating, what was really challenging to me, what was delightful to me was blah, blah, blah. There was a moment that I found really evocative, and you might describe that. So in your handout, there's a more complete list of adjectives that can support this initial step. Like I said, this helps to affirm that communication has happened. As an artist or presenter, it's a vulnerable thing to show your work, and so it's really useful just to be affirmed that the audience has received something, and it starts to build this trust between the audience and the artist as we're going through the feedback process. And we want to avoid, as the audience responders, we want to avoid saying, oh, I liked this, and I liked that, and I liked this, and I liked that. We're trying to get into a more nuanced description of exactly how we connected to the work, what our experience was. Step 2 is the artist as questioner. And in this step, the artist asks very specific questions of the audience, and then the audience responds. So this allows the artist to direct the kind of feedback that's going to be most useful for them in the advancement of their work. And they can ask questions that are pretty general or very specific. So an example of a really general question would be, if I were the artist asking the audience, I might say, what was your emotional journey throughout the piece? Pretty general, and we'll get a lot of different types of responses. A really specific question that I might ask as the artist is, was it effective for me to start the music right at the beginning, or would it have been more effective for me to start a minute into the piece? So those kinds of specific questions can get at, very, very narrow choices that we're trying to decide between. It's all really useful, and in this step of the process, the artist can kind of share what it is that they've been working on, what their primary concerns have been in this iteration or phase of the piece. So an example of that might be, if I'm the artist, I've been really struggling with deciding on different forms of musical accompaniment, and so I want to know how the music impacted your experience of the piece. So step 3 is neutral questions from responders. So this is when the audience asks questions of the artist, but they do it in a very specific framework. And so neutral questions are not questions that we often ask in our daily lives. So this takes practice, and it takes some getting used to. Often when we ask questions, there's an embedded opinion in the question. So for example, if I ask the question as an audience member, why was the piece so short? Well, first of all, my tone might indicate that I have an opinion, but also within the question, there's an embedded opinion that I think the piece should have been longer. So a different way of asking that question, or a way of neutralizing that question, would be to say, what was your intention about the length of the piece? So that can be a kind of a subtle difference, but it, again, helps create this climate of generosity, and it's less likely to trigger defensiveness in the artist. Liz Lerman points out that defensiveness is often a total shutdown to the learning process. So we're trying to avoid that and keep things really engaged and open. So this step also gives the artist an opportunity to describe the places that they have made really deliberate choices, but also to notice if there are places that they haven't really thought through their choices. So now we're on step 4, which is the final step of the process, which is permissioned opinions. And this is when the audience responders give their opinions about the piece, but again within a very specific framework and structure. So the audience, first of all, has more information now that we've gone through this whole process about what the artist's vision and intention and process is. And so the audience identifies a specific element that they have an opinion about, and they ask if the artist wants to hear that. So that might sound like, I have an opinion about the length of the piece. Would you like to hear it? And the artist has the option of saying yes or no. So in this example about the length of the piece, if the artist, let's say, were working with external constraints about the length of it, or they just weren't really interested in exploring, making it any longer or shorter, they were satisfied with the length of the piece, they might say, no, I don't want to hear your opinion about the length of the piece. Another option is that the artist can say, yes, I do want to hear your opinion about the length of the piece. And even in that case, this moment of preparation where the artist can kind of prepare to receive feedback makes a world of difference. And so the permissioned opinions are a really useful tool in the feedbacking process. So those are the 4 steps to the Liz Lerman critical response process. And now we're going to take a look at one of my pieces that we're going to use as a test run or an example. And I'm going to do a role play afterwards where I'm both the artist presenter and the audience feedbacker. So I want you to know that as we're doing this process in class, I will be facilitating and intervening when necessary. So I want you to be aware that you don't have to be perfect at it right away. But I'm going to give this example just so we can start to get a sense of how the process works. Okay, so we'll be having a look at an excerpt from one of my pieces called Investigations of Belonging, which is a site-specific dance piece that travels throughout San Francisco. We're just going to watch a short excerpt. And this draft of the piece that we're about to see was recorded in December of 2014. So let's take a look.
Look, he's slinging Dre beats at a pigeon, bro. Dre beats? Those are not real. Hey, look.
Okay, welcome back. So now I'm going to be modeling the 4 steps of the critical response process. And since I'm going to be playing 2 different roles, I'm going to use a prop to indicate when I'm speaking as the artist presenter, I'll be holding these roses. And when I'm speaking as the audience responder, no props. So we've just seen an excerpt from Investigations of Belonging, and we're going to start with step 1, statements of meaning. I'm just going to give a couple of examples for each step. We're not going to go into a whole long, elaborate process. But again, this is just to give you a feel for it. So I thought there was a really delightful visual resonance between the mural background and the costume that you were wearing. I saw you using a really specific movement vocabulary that was very compelling and engaging. And I thought it was really interesting how the people walking by on the street barely seemed to interact with you. So those are some statements of meaning. Now we're moving on to step 2, the artist as questioner. So, what did you think my relationship to the people passing by on the street was? Well, I thought that you were kind of in your own world a little bit. Like maybe you were looking out towards them at certain points, but mostly it was unclear. Okay, great. That's really good information to have. So I have a specific question about the costume, because the pattern on the costume that I chose wasn't an exact extension of the mural, so I'm wondering if it would be more interesting or effective to have the costume like directly blend in with the mural, or if it was cool or okay that it didn't exactly match up. I thought it was fine that it didn't exactly match up. I think, yeah, it worked for me, how it was. Okay, thanks. Now we're going to move on to step 3, which is neutral questions from the responder. So my first question is, was this an improvised piece or a choreographed piece? This was an improvised piece, but, you know, kind of within a structure that I had set out. Okay, interesting. So how did you determine the style of movement that you were going to be using in the piece? Well, the style of movement, I guess I was inspired by this sort of like angular presence of these angular shapes in the mural and on the costume. And also like there's a sort of roboticness to the style of movement that was like felt really rich for that environment. But honestly, you know, it's kind of just like my favorite kind of dance right now, so I'm not sure that I actually put that much thought into the style of movement. It was really just like doing what felt best in my body at that time. Yeah. Okay, cool. So can you talk about your choice of prop? Yeah, so I used the white roses, as we see here, as my prop because part of the dance for me was this intention of wanting to like give back to the community of the neighborhood that I live in. And so it was this sort of poetic gesture of like offering a bouquet of roses to whoever passed by. This sort of like romantic offering, but coming from a really like anonymous, removed identity, because there's so much anonymity in the urban experience. So yeah, juxtaposing that like blank facelessness with this like really earnest desire to like give someone some flowers, that's the kind of narrative that I was playing with. Great, thanks for that information. Now we're going to move on to step 4, which is permissioned opinions. So I have an opinion about the film quality. Do you want to hear that? Actually, the film quality was kind of just a last minute way of documenting the piece, and it's actually not that important to the piece, so no, I don't want to hear that. Okay, I have an opinion about the interaction with the passersby in the street. Do you want to hear that? Yeah, definitely. I would love to hear that. Okay, so I thought, like I said, it was pretty unclear like what you wanted from the passersby. And now that I've heard that you were really trying to offer them flowers, I think that you could have amplified that intention or made that a little bit more clear and obvious in the piece. Oh, okay, cool, thank you. And we'll end it there. I think that gives you a sense of how the critical response process works. Again, it's an incredibly valuable tool. It can be a little bit awkward to get in the flow of it at first, but we're going to be practicing it plenty. So that concludes